Been one of the best units.
Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire became the official depot and the first stop for volunteers. The training programme was extremely tough in order to weed out unsuitable candidates. The course was designed to instill an offensive spirit, as they would often be dropped into action lightly armed and facing greater numbers. It was this offensive spirit which has seen the paratrooper overcome seemingly overpowering odds throughout the regiment's history. The next operation was to see the regiment perform in its classic role, landing ahead of and cooperating with ground forces. America had recently entered the war, and the parachute regiment was an immediate beneficiary due to increased numbers of C-47 Dakota aircraft being flown direct from the States. The Dakota was a major improvement on the Whitley, as the paratroopers could leave like a gentleman through the door. On November the 8th, 1942, the Allies launched their assault on the North African coast. The objective was the capture of Tunisia in order to cut the Axis line of retreat from the advancing British 8th Army. With Axis power destroyed along the southern shores of the Mediterranean, the way would be open to liberate Europe through Sicily and Italy. The 1st Parachute Brigade formed part of the British First Army and were deployed in the early stages of the campaign. The 3rd Parachute Battalion jumped and took a vital airfield at Beaune between Algiers and Tunis. Coincidentally, just as the British were jumping, the Germans had dispatched a number of Ju-52s loaded with paratroopers bound for the same airfield. They quickly abandoned the idea when it was realized the airfield was in the hands of British paratroopers. 1st Battalion achieved a similar success at Souk el Arba, quickly occupying a key road junction at Beja, only 90 miles from Tunis. The 2nd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Frost, was less fortunate. They were dropped at Depierre with the objective of destroying enemy aircraft on the ground at Udman. However, the airfield was abandoned, and coupled with the fact that the First Army advance had been held up, meant that 2nd Battalion were now 50 miles behind enemy lines. Their fighting withdrawal back to Allied lines had all the epic qualities that were to be the hallmarks of the Parachute Regiment's exploits from Bruneval to Arnhem. Lightly equipped, short of ammunition, and spurred on by Frost's hunting horn, they arrived at Medjez El Bab 2 days later, having lost 16 officers and 250 men. Throughout the North African campaign, 1st Parachute Brigade fought more battles than any other formation in the First Army, often fighting as infantry. They had captured 3,500 prisoners and inflicted over 5,000 casualties at a cost of 1,700 to themselves. Not only did they earn the respect of their army comrades, but also that of the enemy, who christened them the Roter Teufel, Red Devils. The name was taken as a compliment and adopted by all the airborne forces. At the same time, a Tunisian shepherd's call, Waha Muhammad, became the battle cry of the 1st Brigade, and later of all British airborne forces. During June 1943, the depleted 1st Parachute Brigade, here seen being inspected by Field Marshal Montgomery, was joined by the 2nd and 4th Parachute Brigades and the glider-borne 1st Air Landing Brigade. Together, they comprised the operational strength of 1st Airborne Division. Their next objective was the capture of Sicily.
We arrived out in North Africa, that is the 2nd Brigade and the Air Landing Brigade and the divisional headquarters. And we came out and accepted, of course, and the 1st Parachute Brigade reinforced, resupplied with all the soldiers that they needed now, and they were, again, the first people to drop on the Primacoli Bridge in Sicily. Unfortunately, dropped all over the place from Etna, and I believe one airplane went on a 180-degree wrong course and landed in the middle of Africa somewhere. But mostly they did land, and there was, in fact, one company, about a company, that actually captured the bridge and held it. And that was the end of that story. But it showed how it is absolutely essential to land, if not actually on the objective, as close to it as you possibly could. This was the lesson that was completely forgotten and not undertaken at all at Arnhem.
The 2nd Brigade, comprising of the 4th, 5th and 6th Battalions, were to remain in Italy for the remainder of the war. Advancing up through the mainland of Italy was slow and dangerous, Often, they met stiff opposition from the retreating Germans. In order to prevent the Germans from blowing the bridges as they retreated, it was decided to mount an airborne attack well behind enemy lines. A force of 60 men from 6th Battalion boarded 3 Dakotas of US Troop Carrier Command and dropped in daylight near Torricella. Dummies were dropped to exaggerate the size of the force, and the force managed to keep one entire German division occupied for weeks, when its presence would have been invaluable at the front. As the campaign in Italy progressed, plans were at an advanced stage for an airborne assault on mainland Europe. By the end of 1943, there were 2 airborne divisions in the order of battle. The 1st, who had recently returned from North Africa and Sicily, and the 6th under the command of Major General Gale. By numbering the new division the 6th, the British hoped to fool the Germans into believing there was a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Each division consisted of 2 parachute and 1 air landing brigades supported by airborne artillery, engineering, medical, and signals troops. Throughout the latter part of 1943 and the early part of 1944, training was intensified as each soldier rehearsed what would be the liberation of Europe.
For months past now, you have been working hard with one end in view, and all that time in the factories, men and women, probably brothers and sisters of yours, have been working equally hard. We are now going to put these months of work to the test. I would only remind you of the divisional motto: go to it.
3 airborne divisions of American, British, and Canadian troops would lead the assault. They would be facing enormous odds. Every soldier would have to dig deep into his reserves of courage and determination to see the job through. Operation Overlord began on the evening of June the 5th with the emplaning of the gliders and paratroopers. 6th Airborne Division had 3 key objectives. 8th Battalion was to blow the bridges at Bourg and Troarn. 9th Battalion was to silence the batteries that overlooked the landing beaches at Melville, and the 2nd Battalion of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry was to mount a glider-borne assault on the bridge at Bennoville.
When I first got into the glider, in fact, I mean, we sat around for quite a long time before that on the runway waiting to get on. I think all of us, we were getting extremely nervous, and I was getting very frightened, I don't mind telling you, because they told us that they were going to send 150 fighting men plus 30 Royal Engineers into capture these 2 bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. And we thought, God, we're going to be in there, 150 of us, facing the might of the German army. And I thought, well, to do that, even in the sort of best of conditions, was going to be bad. And we were going to do a drop just after midnight onto rough farmland, where intelligence reports only a few days before had come in and said that Rommel had been there and instructed the local people to put up these huge telegraph-type poles, which we called Rommel's asparagus, and they reckoned that if a flimsy glider hit one of those, it would literally disintegrate as it hit the ground, and we normally hit the ground between 80 and 100 miles an hour, so they were very, very flimsy vehicles. It didn't take much for a wing to come off, even at the best of times.
We would then be down on the towpath, the runway, at some about 3 or 4 hours beforehand, and it was always quite a scene. You'd have about 30 gliders, 30 tugs, and the whole station down there, quite a lot of people milling around. And the tug aircraft would line up with the ropes attached to the gliders on the side, with the gliders staggered in pairs up through the main runway. One of the problems was to get the whole batch of aircraft off and airborne and in a decent package as quick as possible. And this did require very, very quick work on the ground crew's part. And we'd aim to get off about every half a minute or so each glider, this sort of thing. So it will take about 15-20 minutes to get a squadron airborne.
Meanwhile, 8th Battalion was getting ready to leave for the bridges at Bourg and Troyes.
It was 37 Dakotas to carry us. They were mostly from the 233 RAF squadron. And there'd be about 20 parachutists in each plane. We took off about 11 p.m. And flew around for an hour or so, getting into formation, and then made straight for the French coast. We were due to drop at about 10 minutes to 1. Now this time was 10 minutes to 1, British double summertime. About 20 minutes, I think, before we were due to jump, we stood up and checked all our equipment and made sure that everybody was hooked up. And then, shortly afterwards, we crossed the coast, and the lights went out. It was in total darkness in the plane, in the cabin. And the flak started coming up, and the plane started taking evasive action, throwing us about, and the flak was rattling the plane like a tin can. And then the red light came on to warn us to be ready for parachuting, and then the green light, and the first man jumped. And then number 2 fell down in the doorway. He was only a little man, and we were each carrying about 100 pounds weight of stuff on us. And he had to be lifted up and pushed out, and that delayed us a bit. And I was jumping number 16, and the man in front of me tried to get back in again. He said, "I'm not hooked up." And I said, "You are," and I pushed him out. Fortunately he was, and he landed all right, but it was absolute chaos. And we're very glad to get out. When I jumped, I realised where I was, and I was south of where I should have been, and I landed in through a little apple tree at the side of the main road which ran from Caen to Troyes. On the other side of this little orchard was the main railway which ran parallel to it. They were about 50 yards apart. When I got on the ground, I found that my stuff, which had been in a kit bag, loaded on a rope, was up in the tree, containing my rifle and spade and small pack. And I didn't know whether to climb the tree to pull it, try and retrieve it that way, or to go on pulling. And the German car came past at that time, driving very fast, and they never saw me, fortunately, so I was glad I didn't climb the tree. And anyway, I went on pulling, and eventually, after about 15 minutes, it came down, so I was able to get all my stuff. I went to the rendezvous at Touffreville, because I realised where I was. You see, I could get my bearings quite easily being between the main road and the railway. And arrived there, probably about an hour later. It was about 2 miles away. And there were very few of our battalion there. An hour after the drop, there should have been over 600. I think probably nearer 700 men there. But because the Pathfinders had been dropped in the wrong place, only half of them were dropped at Touffreville, or should have been dropped at Touffreville, and not all of them were. In fact, it'd be about near 3 hours after the drop. There were only 140 men at the rendezvous, and we thought all was lost.
We are all familiar with the terrifying battlefield images of the First World War. Much less well known are the covert operations and sabotage networks developed by the Germans in an attempt to break the bloody stalemate. Secrets of War investigates Germany's secret gambles at 7 o'clock on Sunday.
Swingy London in the 60s, when suits were sharp and villains were gents. One gang done a trade and nicked £2.5 million.
That was a hell of a lot of money.
They'd have got away with it if it weren't for Tommy Butler.
He was tenacious. He wouldn't let go.
He never got Bigsy. And he never found the money. The Great Train Robbery, Wednesday at 6 on the History Channel.
This is...
The coup de main on the bridge at Benouville, later renamed Pegasus Bridge, was a resounding success. But as they waited for reinforcements to arrive, the whole operation came dangerously close to failing.
We suddenly heard these damn tanks coming, German tanks. And we didn't know, they just started up with a roar, and they seemed as if they were almost on top of us when they started up. And they must have been, because these Germans, a few Germans that were still around that and were still awake when we landed there, they literally just scattered in all directions as we got to that side of the bridge. I mean, we did fire our rifles and we threw some grenades around, but in the main, I mean, the Germans there, they didn't give much of a firefight, they were gone. But what they obviously did was to tell the troops in the adjoining village at Benouville that something horrible was happening on the bridge, and these tanks were started up to come and investigate, and they were literally about 50 yards behind me. I was sort of laying down on this ground, and these damn things suddenly came squealing along, and we thought, oh God, no, tanks, we got nothing to stop them. I mean, we couldn't carry any sort of anti-tank weapon. The only thing we had was a little, it wasn't handheld, it was on a bipod, but a little thing that was called a Piat, and it was projectile infantry anti-tank, it was called. Used to fire a little fat fin-tail bomb, and its maximum distance was about 50 yards or more. So, you know, if you fired that thing and missed the tank, which you quite often did, because it wasn't accurate anyway, and if you missed the tank and it exploded somewhere else, the tank just turned around and blasted you away.
At dawn, as the beach assaults began, some 8 miles inland, 8th Battalion had reached the bridges of Bourg and Troarn, the only hard surface roads in this marshy region.
Well, we were aware that something was happening about the time we went down about 6 a.m. to Bure, because there was a tremendous noise. I'd never heard anything like it before. When the battleships fired their broadsides. So it sounded like a noise rather similar to an express train coming out of a tunnel. And the sky was black with smoke, and then there was bombing going on. There was obviously something going on, but with no means of knowing whether the landings had been successful or not, because remembering what had happened at Dieppe when they were halted on the beaches. And we were up in this position in the woods, well, we were in a very strong defensive position, but very isolated.
Throughout the night, the German defence gradually recovered from their initial surprise. At Merville, there was bitter fighting with a substantially below-strength group from 9th Battalion trying to overcome greater numbers of defenders. It was enough to allow the initial landings to take place. For a detachment of the Ochsenbuck sent to help 7 Para and the hamlet of La Porte, the reinforcements couldn't come soon enough.
We said, right, well, we spread out this field, and if the only way they can get at us is through the church, over the churchyard wall, and we can keep that covered with a machine gun, or they've got to come through that gate. And so we lay there for a while, and a little while later, we heard some Germans in the road just by the church. And a couple of the lads went and lobbed some grenades, a couple of grenades over the wall, and we were virtually out of grenades. Then we were virtually out of bullets as well. But a couple of the lads lobbed grenades over the wall, and we heard Germans, so it went off on the Germans screaming. And then some German in perfect English, he said, "You English in the churchyard, you're totally surrounded, you can't get out, leave your weapons behind and come out, and no harm will come to you." And we said, thanks very much. And I think I was, myself and one other one, we had about the last 2 grenades that we got between us. We went up and said, right, you want some of our weapons? We lobbed those over the wall and went back to the field by the churchyard. And a little while later, 2 Germans came through this gateway. First one looked through and he sort of poked his head round the corner, and then another one came up behind him, looked round the other corner. They both sort of doing this. And then they obviously thought we'd gone, so they came out and stepped out in the field, and we belted them down, shot them both out of the ground. And it was a little while after that we said, well, you know, we've had it. We've actually run out of ammunition. We've got no more ammunition for the machine gun, actually no more ammunition for the rifles. We've got no grenades left, and the Germans are in all the cottages across a few 40 or 50 yards away. And it was then that we suddenly heard the sound of this the commando bagpipes, the most weird thing that you've ever imagined. You know, every one of us was English, and we thought, God, that sounds like heaven.
Time and again, during the Normandy campaign, the airborne forces found themselves in the midst of the most bitter of fighting. At Berville, the Germans sought to drive a wedge between the Allied beachheads. It took many hours of determined fighting to finally clear the village. It was not until early September that 6th Airborne Division was to return to it. While the main invasion was taking place in the north, a second attack was mounted in the south of France on August the 15th. Although mainly an American operation, the British 2nd Independent Parachute Brigade Group jumped as part of 1st Airborne Task Force. Their objective was to take the area around La Motte and La Mouille, and to prevent the enemy from reaching the coast where the seaborne assault would be mounted. They met little opposition, and by nightfall had achieved all their objectives. There was little attempt by the enemy to counterattack, and on the 17th, they linked up with the seaborne force. On the 26th, the brigade returned to Italy to prepare for the invasion of Greece. In tandem with the evolution of the paratrooper, there had been a similar commitment to developing a military glider. The glider fulfilled 2 basic requirements of airborne warfare. Firstly, they provided a quick and economical means of delivering reinforcements in support of the initial parachute landings. Secondly, they could transport the heavy equipment such as jeeps, Bren carriers, and artillery. They were made of wood, and their components were made by joinery businesses all over the country. The first gliders entered service in 1940. Called Hotspurs, they could carry 8 soldiers. They remained in service as trainers when the larger Horsa became the workhorse of the air landing brigades.
The Horsa could carry 28 fully equipped soldiers, although we tended to say it's more a matter of the load it could carry. If we worked on saying the fact that it could carry about 3.5 ton, we could then equate that either as equipment, stores, men, or men and stores, and so on. I think this is very, very important to get away from thinking that it was purely the men. It was a load we could carry.
Later in the war, the Howell car came into service. This leviathan of a glider could carry up to 16 tons of equipment, light tanks, or 40 troops over 400 miles. In the early years, the glider was entirely disposable. Soldiers invariably hacked their way out if a section of the glider was not already damaged on landing. Horsers and Hamilcars had hinged noses so that loading and disembarking could take place more easily and prolong the life of the glider for further operations. However, in environments like the forest clearings of Burma, the landing zones were often too short for powered aircraft. This led to a retrieval technique called snatching. A line was extended from the glider and stretched between 2 posts. The retrieving aircraft would then swoop down and catch the tow rope using a hook attached under the fuselage. Not the smoothest way to take off, but very effective in getting gliders and men off landing zones. With the Germans now retreating through France, Montgomery proposed that an Allied force should seize separate bridges over the Rhine and so gain access to Hitler's industrial heartland. It would, he argued, shorten the war by many months. It was an operation that could not come soon enough for 1st Airborne Division. Operation Market Garden began on the morning of Sunday, September the 17th. Under clear, sunny skies, the 1st Airborne took off and linked up with the American 101st Airborne, who were to attack Eindhoven, and the 82nd Airborne, who would land at Grave and Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne and 1st Polish Brigades were destined for the end of the line, Arnhem. The whole enterprise was doomed from the start. There were not enough aircraft to tow the gliders, and so several drops over 4 days were planned. But perhaps the biggest error of judgment was to ignore the lessons of the past and choose dropping zones up to 8 miles from their prime target, the bridge itself. The first landings went almost unopposed, but it did not take long for the Germans to recover and counterattack.
The first thing I was aware of, or the next thing I was aware of, was that the port engine was shot out and the starboard engine was on fire on the other side of the aircraft. Half a dozen or more of the chaps were dead, as far as I could see, on the floor, killed by small arms machine gun fire. And I was a bit worried whether we were all going to get out alive, because the plane was going down fairly fast. In fact, I believe it was no more than about 350 to 400 feet from the ground when we eventually bailed out. But it was that or go in with it, of course.
Unfortunately, there were 70,000 German troops in the Arnhem area. There was also the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Division, equipped with the lightly armed airborne soldiers' most feared weapon, the Tiger tank. Soon communications were breaking down as the casualties started to mount.
Soon after we landed on the dropping zone, the divisional headquarters was set up on the edge of the forest, and the brigade that had moved off, the 1st brigade that moved off, was moving as fast as they possibly could up to the bridge. About after a few hours, the communications started to fail, and my commanding officer sent me off to find out what was going wrong.
Well, say, one, we didn't really know what was going on. We only knew what was going on in our little area, and many of my squadrons were getting picked off one at a time. A couple died here. We still didn't know what was going on, what to do. As I say, nobody told us to retreat, no one told us to advance. We were just stuck there. More and more men were getting wounded, and we just didn't know what was happening. We just knew it was happening in our little area. There was odd attempts to go to some other grouping, to find out what was going on. They knew as much as we did. Well, we don't know, except those at the Hartenstein Hotel, which was headquarters. But we just stayed where we were in an area until the Monday night, when we get this order that we're pulling out.
A small detachment commanded by Colonel John Frost did make it to the bridge, but could get no further as they came under constant bombardment from the Germans. Gradually, the force became more and more isolated.
My furthest place that I got to was about half a mile short of the bridge. I found myself with about a few members of a company that had, a number of whom had been killed on the way up, and we occupied a house on the edge of the Rhine. And my orders, of course, were to hold that and then get back as soon as we could. Unfortunately, the ammunition was falling. I think we were down to about 10 rounds a man, and at just about that time, the Germans were attacking like hell and trying to get us out.
What was left of the 10th Battalion was dug in near the Hartenstein Hotel.
The battle was intense all around the Hartenstein, and the time came when I was told to take my group round to the back of the Hartenstein, because they were coming under more intense fire from the rear of the Hartenstein. So we were there for a day or so, and then we were told to move down to the river. At night we were told to move down to the river. And it was dark, we'd got no ammunition. Most people had jettisoned their weapons because there was just no ammunition.
On the 9th day, the order was given for a general withdrawal. White tapes marked the route to the river, where the survivors could try and take boats or swim. Under the cover of night, they crept down to the river. Many had already fallen into enemy hands.
The only way I could see which was possible was to lock myself into a cupboard in one of the rooms in this place where we all were, and hoping in about 2 or 3 days the First Army would relieve us. But the following day after I'd done this, because I only went in with a lump of rye bread and about a quart of water, and I thought that would be enough for 2 or 3 days. The next day they turned the room outside my cupboard into an interrogation center, and the German intelligence officer had his chair with his back to where I was, questioning individually people as they came forward. So it was an interesting event to actually hear somebody else being questioned who'd just been captured.
Dean Drummond did escape back to England thanks to the bravery of the Dutch resistance. He was, however, one of the few. For of the 10,000 who left England, over 7,000 were killed or captured. On October the 12th, 4th Battalion dropped onto Megara airfield in Greece. The operation was to secure the country as the Germans retreated. Having been welcomed as heroes, they were soon involved in vicious street fighting between the various political factions as they sought to fill the power vacuum left by the Germans. It was dirty fighting, as the enemy were difficult to identify. They wore no uniform and were not above using human shields of women and children. Then, at Christmas 1944, the Germans launched a massive counterattack through the Ardennes in a bid to split the Allied forces. 6th Airborne were rushed across the Channel once more, this time by ship, to help counter the offensive. Through one of the coldest winters this century, the division gradually stemmed the advancing tide of German armor. By the beginning of March 1945, the Allies had reached the Rhine. This gate to the heart of Germany, though shut, was not securely bolted, and the Allies were poised to burst it open. Montgomery, now Colonel Commandant of the Parachute Regiment, was determined that the Second Army should lead that push. The British 6th and US 17th Airborne Divisions were placed under the command of the Second Army. The landing zone was to be at Hammenkeln in the Wesel region. Here they were to disrupt the German defenses and take the bridges over the River Isle. 3rd and 5th Parachute Brigades of the 6th Airborne Division would secure the landing zones for the gliders, bringing in the 6th Air Landing Brigade, made up of the Ox and Bucks, the Devons, and the Royal Ulster Rifles. Over 3,000 aircraft would drop the two divisions in little over 2 hours, and so absolute precision was necessary. However, following Arnhem, there was an acute shortage of glider pilots, as they had either been killed or taken prisoner. RAF pilots, therefore, had to be retrained to fly gliders and fight as infantry. At dawn, March the 24th, the 21st Allied Army Group began to cross the Rhine. At 0600 hours, the first tugs with their gliders rolled down the runway and linked up with the rest of the Armada to form the largest airborne force ever seen. Attacks on the German airfields the previous week meant that the force was untouched by the Luftwaffe. The landing, however, was not unopposed. Despite many casualties, the village of Hammenkelm fell within an hour of the first glider landing. The bridges over the IJssel were also taken intact. By 13:30 hours, the British 6th Airborne Division had achieved their objectives and had linked up with the advancing 21st Army Group. And so the race across Germany began. From March the 26th to May the 2nd, the 6th Airborne Division fought its way up through Germany, covering 350 miles, mostly on foot. This constantly changing, fluid kind of fighting was ideal for the highly motivated, lightly armed airborne soldier. Finally, just east of Wismar on the Baltic coast, the Red Devils met up with the Soviet Army Advance Guard. It was the end of the Third Reich and the war in Europe. But as everyone posed for smiling photographs, it seemed inconceivable that within a year the Iron Curtain would be clamped across Europe, that the heroes of Bruneval, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, Arnhem and the Rhine crossing would be vilified as worse than the Gestapo by the very people they had helped to free from Belsen. Such is the nature of war, and one which Britain's airborne forces would experience many times in the years that followed the end of the war.
If you have a story to tell about your own personal history experience, or if you'd like more information on the History Channel, write to us at the History Channel, Grant Way, Isleworth, Middlesex, TW7 5QD, or visit our website at www.the